On the night of July 22nd, 1991, a man ran through the streets of Milwaukee with a handcuff still hanging from his left wrist. He was not running from a stranger. He had just escaped from apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street, and inside that apartment police would find 11 human skulls, a freezer, a 57-gallon blue drum, and Polaroid photographs the officers refused to describe out loud. The tenant, 21-year-old Tracy Edwards, told 2 patrol officers that a weird dude had tried to chain him inside. How does a man kill 17 people over 13 years in a building where neighbors complained about the smell and stay invisible until a stranger runs into the street with a handcuff? The first officer on scene took less than 10 minutes to realize what he was standing inside. Tonight, the timeline of that final apartment, the 7 men killed in those walls, the neighbors who called, the calls that went nowhere, and one detail from that night that Milwaukee detectives still cannot square. Detail number 3 is the one that still troubles investigators. If you follow cases like this, subscribe. We cover a new one every week. To understand apartment 213, you have to understand the address itself. The Oxford Apartments stood at 924 North 25th Street on Milwaukee's near west side. It was a low-rent, 3-story red brick building with 49 units in a neighborhood that had been slowly hollowed out through the 1980s. Rent for a small 1-bedroom was around $300 a month. The tenants were mostly working poor, many of them black, many of them families. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, a white chocolate factory worker from Ohio, moved into Unit 213 in May of 1990. He was 30 years old. He had already killed 5 people. Within 15 months, he would kill 12 more, and 7 of those murders would happen inside the walls of that single apartment. Dahmer had been living with his grandmother in West Allis for years before that. She was, by all accounts, a devout, gentle woman who had no idea what her grandson was doing in her basement. When she finally asked him to leave in 1988, citing his drinking and the strange smells coming from below, he moved into a series of short-term places before signing the lease at the Oxford. He picked 213 because it was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a hallway. Only one neighbor shared a common wall. That neighbor was a woman named Pamela Bass, who lived in 214. She would later tell reporters that Jeff had, on more than one occasion, offered her sandwiches. She ate them. The apartment itself was small. A single bedroom, a living room, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom. When police finally documented it, the total livable space was under 400 square feet. Dahmer paid the rent on time. He kept to himself. He worked the overnight shift at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company on East Highland Avenue, mixing vats of chocolate from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. His coworkers described him as quiet, polite, occasionally funny. Nobody who worked with him has ever said on the record that they suspected anything. The first murder inside apartment 213 took place on the night Dahmer moved in, or within days of it. His victim was Raymond Smith, also known as Ricky Beeks, 32 years old. Dahmer met him at a bar called the Phoenix on South 2nd Street, invited him back to the new apartment for money and photographs, and, according to Dahmer's own later confession to Detective Patrick Kennedy, drugged him with a mixture of sleeping pills crushed into a drink. Ricky Smith never left the apartment alive. Dahmer photographed his body with a Polaroid camera he had bought specifically for that purpose. Those photographs, along with dozens of others, would be found in a bedroom drawer 13 months later. What followed at the Oxford between May 1990 and July 1991 was a pattern so consistent that once detectives understood it, they could almost predict the missing pieces. Dahmer would go to a bar, an adult bookstore, or a shopping mall. He would approach a young man, almost always black, Asian, or Latino, almost always slim, almost always alone. He would offer money, usually $50 to $200, in exchange for posing for photographs at his apartment. Some of the men who went with him survived, because Dahmer either lost his nerve or was interrupted. The ones who did not survive were drugged, killed, photographed, and dismembered in the bathroom or the kitchen. Dahmer told investigators he used a hacksaw, that he boiled the skulls in a large pot with Soilex, a caustic industrial cleaner, to strip them down, and that he stored certain body parts in the freezer and refrigerator. Some remains were dissolved in a 57-gallon blue plastic drum of hydrochloric acid that stood in the bedroom. Others were placed in a filing cabinet. None of this happened in the deep woods or a rented cabin. It happened in a rented apartment where the woman on the other side of the wall was watching television. Neighbors did notice. They noticed the smell first. Pamela Bass in 214 described it to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel as being like rotten meat or a dead animal in the walls. She complained to the building manager, Sopa Princewill. Dahmer told the manager the smell was from meat that had gone bad in a broken freezer. Princewill accepted the explanation. Other tenants reported hearing a saw running at strange hours and thuds that sounded like something heavy hitting the floor. One tenant said Dahmer told her he was doing home repairs. Another said she once heard what sounded like a man screaming briefly, late at night. The police were called to the Oxford several times during those 15 months. None of those calls led to a search of 213. The most damaging of those calls happened on the night of May 27, 1991. A 14-year-old boy named Conorak Synthesomphone was found on the street, naked, bleeding from the rectum, disoriented, and unable to speak coherently. Two young black women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, called 911 and stayed with him. When officers John Balcherzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived, along with a third officer, Richard Porubkin, Dahmer walked up and calmly explained that the boy was his 19-year-old lover and that they had had a fight. Dahmer was 31, white, articulate, and sober-seeming. Conorak, drugged with the pills Dahmer had given him earlier that evening, could not contradict him. The officers walked Dahmer and the boy back to apartment 213. Inside on the floor were the remains of Conorak's older brother's killer's previous victim, Tony Hughes. The smell was noticeable. The officers did not search. They left Conorak with Dahmer. Within an hour, Conorak Synthesomphone was dead. The officers, on their radio, joked about the call being an intoxicated boyfriend dispute and said they needed to be deloused. That recording exists. It was played at trial. And this is where the numbered detail comes in, the one that Milwaukee investigators and later oversight boards could not reconcile. Because the Synthesomphone family had a history with Dahmer that the officers, in theory, could have discovered in minutes. In 1988, 3 years earlier, Dahmer had drugged and molested Conorak's older brother, Somsak Synthesomphone, in a separate incident. He had been convicted for it. He was, at the moment officers Balcherzak and Gabrish walked up to apartment 213, an actively registered sex offender on probation for a crime against a member of the exact family whose younger son he was now standing next to. That information was in the system. It was not checked. The 3 officers on scene and the dispatcher never ran him. Conorak died as a direct consequence of that non-search. When the truth came out, Balcherzak and Gabrish were fired, though they were later reinstated with back pay after appeals through the police union. That decision drew protests that lasted for years. Balcherzak went on to be elected president of the Milwaukee Police Association in 2005, which reopened every wound the case had ever caused. After Conorak, Dahmer killed 4 more men inside 213, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. The pattern accelerated. He was, by his own admission to investigators, drinking heavily and barely sleeping. He had been fired from Ambrosia Chocolate on July 15, 1991 for chronic absenteeism. He had rent due. He had at that point 3 human heads in his refrigerator or freezer, a torso in the drum, and photographs stacked in a drawer. And then, on the evening of July 22, 1991, he brought home Tracy Edwards. Edwards was 32 years old. He had met Dahmer at the Grand Avenue Mall earlier that day. Dahmer offered him $100 to come to the apartment and pose for photographs. Edwards agreed. Once inside, Dahmer's demeanor shifted. He put a handcuff on Edwards' left wrist and tried to close the second cuff on the right, but Edwards, larger and stronger than Dahmer had expected, kept his arm rigid. Dahmer produced a knife. He put on a videotape. Reports differ on what it was, but it was one of the horror films Dahmer often watched. Edwards, in later interviews, said he spent the next hour or so keeping Dahmer talking, complimenting him, agreeing with him, waiting for a chance. When Dahmer went briefly into the bathroom, Edwards struck him in the face, kicked him in the stomach, and ran out the front door with the loose handcuff still dangling from his wrist. He flagged down a Milwaukee police cruiser at the corner of North 25th and Kilbourne. Officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller were inside. Edwards told them what had happened. He walked them back to 213. Dahmer answered the door calmly. He offered to get the key to the cuffs from the bedroom. Officer Mueller followed him instead. In the bedroom, Mueller opened a drawer and saw the Polaroids. He turned to his partner and said, according to the police report, "These are for real." Dahmer lunged. Both officers wrestled him to the floor of the living room and cuffed him. Then they opened the refrigerator. What the officers found over the next several hours became the evidence log that convicted Dahmer. In the refrigerator, a severed head. In the freezer, 2 more, plus assorted body parts. In the bedroom closet, a kettle containing hands and a penis. On a shelf, 3 more skulls that had been cleaned and painted gray, Dahmer later saying he had planned to build a private altar. In the 57-gallon drum, 3 torsos in a dark acid slurry. In the filing cabinet, bones and a 4th skull. In the drawer, 74 Polaroids documenting victims at various stages, some alive and posed, some dead, some in the process of dismemberment. The lead detective, Patrick Kennedy, would later say that the smell inside the apartment was so strong that officers had to rotate in shifts of about 20 minutes. The medical examiner, Jeffrey Jensen, worked at the scene for the better part of 4 days. Dahmer confessed almost immediately, and he kept confessing. Over roughly 60 hours of interviews with Detective Kennedy, he laid out 17 murders, beginning with Stephen Hicks in Ohio in 1978 and ending with Joseph Bradehoft in Milwaukee in July of 1991. He identified victims from photographs. He drew diagrams. He explained, without visible emotion, the sequence and method of each killing. He did not, at any point, claim innocence. His defense at trial, which began in January 1992 in front of Judge Lawrence Graham, was insanity, that he could not have controlled his compulsions. The jury rejected it after roughly 5 hours of deliberation on February 15, 1992. He was convicted of 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 957 years. Wisconsin had no death penalty. He was later extradited briefly to Ohio, pleaded guilty to the Hicks murder, and received a 16th life sentence. What became of Apartment 213 itself is part of the story that people rarely tell in full. After the crime scene was processed, the unit was sealed. The building's owner tried to rent it again. No one would take it. Local activists, led by families of the victims, pushed for the building to be torn down entirely, arguing that as long as it stood, it would attract tourists, ghouls, and grief. In November 1992, the Campbell Soup Company and a consortium of local donors bought the Oxford Apartments outright. The building was demolished the same month. The city of Milwaukee kept the land vacant. Multiple proposals over the years to build a memorial garden on the site have stalled. As of today, if you go to 924 North 25th Street, you find a fenced, empty lot with tall grass. There is no plaque. There is no marker for the 11 men known to have died inside the building that used to stand there. As for the physical contents of the apartment, most were destroyed by court order after the trial. The furniture, the drum, the freezer, the refrigerator, the kettle, the filing cabinet, the tools, all incinerated by court order, in part to prevent them from being sold as murderabilia. A small group of investors did purchase some of Dahmer's personal effects in 1996, reportedly for around $400,000, with the stated intention of destroying them. According to court filings, they did. But rumors persist that some Polaroids, or copies of them, still exist in private hands. The Milwaukee Police Department has never confirmed this. Dahmer himself did not survive prison long. On the morning of November 28, 1994, at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, he was on a work detail cleaning a bathroom in the prison gym with another inmate, Jesse Anderson. A third inmate, Christopher Scarver, who was serving life for an unrelated murder, stayed behind after the guards moved on. Scarver later told investigators that he had confronted Dahmer about the photographs of victims and about a habit Dahmer had of shaping food into body parts to disturb other inmates. He beat Dahmer to death with a metal bar taken from the weight room. Anderson was also killed in the same attack and died 2 days later. Dahmer's body was cremated. His ashes were divided between his mother, Joyce Flint, and his father, Lionel Dahmer. And this is where the case, for many people in Milwaukee, does not close. Because the horror of Apartment 213 was never really only about one man in one apartment. It was about the neighbors who called and were not heard, the officers who walked a bleeding 14-year-old boy back into a killer's living room, the department that reinstated those officers, the families of Errol Lindsay, of Tony Hughes, of Konarak Synthesomphone, of Oliver Lacey, of Jeremiah Weinberger, of Curtis Strouder, of Matt Turner, of Joseph Braidhoft, of Ernest Miller, of David Thomas, of Anthony Sears, and of Raymond Smith. Families who spent years asking why their sons and brothers were not looked for the way other missing men would have been. Investigators who worked the case have said, on the record, that if any of the men who reported smells, sounds, or missing loved ones had been treated with the seriousness their reports deserved, the last 7 murders inside that apartment might never have happened. That is not a theory. It is what the Internal Milwaukee Police Department Review, released in October 1991 under Chief Philip Areola, concluded in more measured language. Today, more than 3 decades later, the fenced lot on North 25th Street still sits empty. The families of the victims still meet occasionally on the anniversary of the arrest. Detective Patrick Kennedy, who took Dahmer's confession, retired from the force and has spoken publicly about the case only rarely. Tracy Edwards, the man who walked out of apartment 213 alive with a handcuff on his wrist, went on to struggle with homelessness and legal problems for the rest of his life, and died in 2011 after falling from a bridge into the Milwaukee River during an altercation. His death was ruled a homicide by a third party and remains, in a strange final echo, one more open file connected to that address. Apartment 213 no longer exists. But every question it raised about who gets looked for, who gets believed, and how a killer can operate for over a year in a building full of people who noticed something was wrong is still, in Milwaukee and elsewhere, unresolved. If this case stayed with you, do one thing: subscribe to Dark Cases and turn on the bell. Next week we go inside another apartment, another address, another silence that lasted too long. Share this video with someone who cares about the victims whose names deserve to be said out loud, and leave the name of the man from this case whose story you want us to tell in full next.